Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Would Your Ideal World Be? A new podcast which examines many important people and the important things in their lives, what they think about most current trends at the moment, what they think about certain subject matters, and of course, what their ideal world would be. Steve Laws is UKIP's current immigration spokesman, as well as being a freelance journalist. He came to prominence in 2020 and 2021 during the illegal migration crisis in the UK, and is perhaps one of the best known names covering the issue online, next only to Nigel Farage, with his undercover videos and reports gaining thousands of shares online as well as views. He has also worked with the populist right outlet Politicalite by offering exclusive information on the unfolding crisis. He is currently standing as the UKIP candidate in the Southend West by-election, of which is one of the main focuses of this interview. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was that you've been elected as the MP for Southend West, hypothetically, and you just entered Parliament for the first time. What is the first major policy you seek to achieve while there, and who you work with in order to achieve that goal?
First major policy?
Yeah, that you want to, that you wish to sort of like hammer home or work on, pretty much.
Well, I'd like to raise awareness, and get the illegal immigration stopped for one. That would be a clear focus, as well as another focus. It'd be between the two. We're probably trying to get more council houses for the locals as well.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And if you don't mind me asking, also, what was your red pill moment?
My red pill moment.
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, it was the first week down the docks when I thought, sitting there, and I thought this isn't, like, obviously you hear about it, you don't realize how bad and how pre-planned it is until I'd spent a week at the docks, and then I realized that this is just grand scale mass immigration coming through illegally, and it's all organized and all pre-planned, and I looked at it from every possible angle. And when you realize that that's actually what's happening in front of you, it is a bit of a red pill moment, I'd give you that.
Fair enough. And I'm going to talk to you more about that subject in a minute, but first I want to ask you about the by-election itself. So why have you decided to stand in this by-election?
Well, basically just to give ordinary people a voice. So because obviously what happened to Sir David Ames was a bit tragic, obviously, murdered by an Islamic terrorist, and it's horrible what happened, but ultimately it wouldn't have happened if he was still alive and his policies would carry on. But the person who's going to replace him, the Conservative candidate, she's just going to be a career politician who's just going to be shooed in and be another yes sir, no sir for Boris. And the way the Conservatives are at the moment are absolutely awful. And I felt the people of Southend West deserved an alternative, someone who actually cares about genuine problems, not just sound bites.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And how do you feel that UKIP is one of the few sort of big name parties to actually stand on the ballot in this by-election, given the fact that all the other parties pretty much have said they're not interested because of what happened?
Well, it's like a touchy subject for some parties, because they've set the precedent when it happened, when Joe Cox was murdered, and obviously the Conservatives stepped down, and that sort of set the precedent, so Labour and that would return the favour. But it's only a new thing that happened. In 1990, an MP was murdered by an IRA terrorist.
Ian Gale.
Yeah, Ian Gale, that's the name. I've been trying, every time I try and say this Tory, I forget the name. Thanks for that.
That's all right.
And then the Lib Dems got in, and with like a 20% swing. So it's only a recent thing that's actually happened. And the reason UKIP stood is because we believe that they deserve an alternative. You can't just give the Conservatives a free ride when they're completely betraying the people that voted for them.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And how do you feel that several politicians of all stripes, it seems, have attacked you for standing at all, which is something that's perfectly legal, obviously? And one Conservative councillor, I can't remember the dude's name, he dismissed you as an extremist. He called you far right and all this stuff. What do you think they actually do this sort of thing? Do you think they're continuing with just simply the anti-UKIP bias that has been prevalent for years now, or rather they're scared of the electoral threat that someone like you poses, given the issues that you stand on?
That's ultimately the problem, because I'm an ordinary person. I'm not from some rich background. I'm not wealthy. I'm just an ordinary bloke. I live in a flat, and I talk about issues that concern normal people, and I have no concerns about rattling the right cages to get things done. So it really does concern the Labour and Conservative people, because they're basically the same party. The policies they run on are almost similar. So having someone rock the boat is going to be very difficult for them, especially if someone rocks the boat successfully and people realize that there can be genuine change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on that, there's a very interesting article in the Times talking about your position pretty much on this thing, and that they should probably stand all these parties. It's a very interesting article by Patrick Maguire in case anyone wants to read it. Anyway, the next thing I wanted to ask you is that Why did you decide to join UKIP specifically, a party perceived by many to be, electorally on the downturn, as opposed to, say, up and coming right wing parties like, say, Reform, Reclaim, and Heritage? Why UKIP specifically?
Well, personally, I've always been a supporter of UKIP in the past, so there's always been that sort of connection where I voted for them in the past before, etc. And I don't see them as a finished party at all, to be honest. I see the new manifesto. I waited until the new manifesto was released before I committed to join into the party. And once I'd read the manifesto, everything was spot on. The direction they're going is completely better than everyone else that I've seen. So, in my opinion, it made sense to join with them when everything they're standing and offering is what I stand for.
Mm-hmm. And if what could say, I know they're not standing in this election, but like say some of these other right-wing parties, what could UKIP offer to say a lot of these conservative-minded voters that say a lot of these alternative right-wing parties can't? Do you think?
Well, I just think the difference between us and other right-wing parties is some other right-wing parties have been founded by Tory donors, etc. If you look at UKIP now, the people that are in it are just ordinary people. There's no A-listers, there's no big names, there's no egos. It's simply people that want the best for the country. And I believe that to go forward, it's not going to be about egos and big names or anything like that. You just need normal people with normal voices that people are going to resonate with and understand that you're going to try your best to give them the best possible help you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. And also on that, if you do well in this by-election, could this signal a comeback for UKIP and, as Neil Hamilton said, the current party leader on GB News recently, fill the gap for a real Conservative party?
Well, ideally, that would be the ideal solution, is that we can rebuild and we can become a genuine opposition. But obviously, it's baby steps, and we have to get seats in places first, whether that be councillors or MPs. We need more and more people in seats before you can even consider being in the opposition. But ultimately, that's the direction that we want to go, because the Conservatives are not Conservatives. Trade and Standards should be looking at them, if anything. So really, like, there needs to be a genuine alternative, and there's so many parties that have come and go, and UKIP still stood there strong and handled all of the media backlash that they've got, and they've still come forward and they're still pushing on. And that's why I believe that they could eventually get there once the change has begun.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think are the current failures then of the Conservative Party as it stands at the moment?
Well, it's pretty clear that the fact that they locked down the nation, destroyed businesses, that's one. Then you've got the fact that they're selling off all of the council houses. You've got the fact that mass immigration is higher than it's ever been, even under a Labour government. Illegal immigration is completely out of control. Last year, it was 28,500. This year, we're already almost over 500 that have came over, and we're only on the 13th of January. So you can already see the president set that is going to be even out of control. The fact that the Tories lie about every policy they've put in place, they're just no longer trustable. They're no longer fit to govern, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think that they give a lot of tough rhetoric? We see, well, Priti Patel gives a new speech about how she's going to crack down on this stuff. Why do you think that they do all this sort of stuff, and yet the reality is so strikingly different? Do you think there's certain dealings involved that stop them from actually tackling this stuff?
I think it's genuinely to keep the Tory loyalists from considering about going elsewhere. And once they consider going elsewhere and they do it, there's not really much turning back, because you look back on the Conservatives and you realise that they're just getting worse and they're getting worse. So all of these sound bites by Priti Patel, Boris Johnson, like for instance, they've all said that we're going to send them back and we're going to cut it in illegal immigration in half, and so on and so on. But all of it is just lies. But they're clever about how they lie. They don't technically lie. They use words that are misleading to the public. But if you don't read between the lines, you won't get the truth.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the reason that illegal immigration has gotten so out of control under their sort of watch is because of the fact that Boris Johnson, he has spoken in favour of having an amnesty a couple of times, especially when he was London mayor? Do you think this might be sort of the necessary crisis to facilitate that, at least in their minds?
Oh, absolutely. They're definitely facilitating it, because you wouldn't make everything so open and so available for them if you was trying to make the route difficult and stop the crossings. As soon as they arrive, they get given money, cash, they get given phones, clothing, new laptops, get straight to a hotel. And then once they've been in a hotel for a few months, they get put into social housing. They're picked up mid-channel. They don't even have to complete the journey no more. And you can even call into the Coast Guard and they will come out and rescue you. And then ultimately, all of these pull factors tell you that the Conservatives want this to happen, because if they didn't, there would be some sort of sign that they're going to stop it. But all it is more and more incentives being offered.
Mhm. What do you think they've got to gain from this? Because as far as I'm aware, a lot of, say, first generation, second generation immigrant voters, if they do go ahead with an amnesty, or mostly Labour voters, and that's according to several studies. Why do you think? Wouldn't they be essentially signing their own, electoral suicide if they did that? Then why would they do it?
See, this is where it's misleading. I don't think there will all be Labour voters, because there will be some that will be Labour voters, obviously, but a lot of them will remember that it was a Conservative government that brought them over. It was a Conservative government that put them in houses. It was a Conservative government that gave them all the money, the clothes, the phones. They will remember that.
Hmm. And do you think it's also because of some of these collusions with big business? Because we have seen Serco, this thing that was, if I'm not mistaken, a former Conservative MP's brother who runs it, Rupert Soames. Do you think it's like a lot of these dealings with these companies is why they're doing it, because they're getting rich off the back of it as well?
Oh, absolutely. These businesses are absolutely out of control. They have more power than most countries, if I'm honest with you. Like the amount of reach that Serco has in this country, from controlling prisons to immigration. Here's what's mad: they control immigration to, like, for all of the resources. For instance, they're putting them in hotels, giving them clothing, etc., etc. And they also control the border force. So their job is to stop these people, but they also get paid when these people come over. So it's a real catch-22 in the fact that you have these even involved on both sides. They should be two very separate institutions. You shouldn't have the border force controlled by the same people that are housing them in hotels.
Hmm. And one quick anecdote, actually, before I ask you the next question. Rupert Soames has written some very interesting things on his Twitter account, being essentially pro-EU, pro-globalist, and I think pro-open borders. I did an article about this a little while ago, in case anyone wants to go and look. But at the same time, it's like, if I'm not mistaken, at least when John Major was at government, I'm not praising him particularly. At least there was sort of a sense that they would actually tackle this issue. I mean, Michael Howard, to his credit, like, did try and whittle down on asylum claims and so on, and that was the last year that saw net negative immigration. Why do you think that this has been so, different now from the Blair government onwards? Why do you think that there's been such a change in attitude among the government, pretty much, towards immigration?
Because it's a different type of people in the Conservative government to what it was 10, 15 years ago. The people that are in it now are very more liberal, and it seems like a lot more people are more open to Conservatives because they're leaning more and more to the centre, or even to the left on some occasions. And that's obviously becoming a pull factor for people who have open border views, but also have financial conservative views. So they're leaning that side for their sake of their money, their businesses, etc. But they're also bringing over their open borders and their globalism views to the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party are open and welcome arms because all they care about is votes. So if this brings more votes, it brings more votes. So that's what I think is why it's carrying on as it is.
Mm-hmm. And on that subject matter, what do you think that sort of started to set in, given the fact that even as recently as I would say again, the major government, they wouldn't do stuff like this, at least from what I've read about them. What do you think sort of like the rot started to set in when it came to a lot of these sort of people entering the Conservative Party, whereas before they wouldn't have been welcomed to such huge numbers?
I think it has to do some. Well, I can't say for sure, but I feel like it has something to do with maybe donors. They maybe have new types of donors that are investing, and obviously they need the money for what they do. So if they've got donors saying, "Oh, push this agenda," maybe they're thinking, "Well, if that can pay for this bill to get through, blah 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 blah, we may allow it with that." And I think that might have something to do with it. But obviously, unless you're involved in the Conservative Party up the top ranks, you're not really going to know that for sure.
Hmm. And another thing on that is that, how do you feel about sort of like the rumblings that are going on, at least in the press, at least in some elements of conservative circles, the fact that there's a lot of growing discontent towards the way that Boris Johnson is leading the party, and given all the stuff that's happened recently, like the parties and the by-election that he lost in North Shropshire. How do you feel the fact that there is this discontent sort of bubbling up, and do you think it will lead to anything positive?
Well, here's the concern. Like, Boris is obviously he's a terrible prime minister, but who in the Conservative Party is any better? This is the problem. So what's the agenda behind pushing Boris to go? Is it to halt Brexit in any way and try and reverse it? I mean, to sort of cause some sort of difficulty? Is it because it to be to do with the lockdowns and, like, obviously Big Pharma being involved? There's all sorts of factors behind, not just we don't like Boris and we want him gone. So I feel like the Conservatives are pulling together, but I don't think it's going to be a positive thing, because a positive thing for the Conservatives Party would be a split between the true Conservatives and the ones that are not. Mm-hmm. And that, if you could get that divide down the middle, you'd see who was actually had the best interest and who didn't.
Hmm. And how do you feel that the top contenders, it seems, for who could possibly replace someone like Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, who, I don't know. How do you feel about the fact that those are sort of like the top two contenders?
Well, it doesn't really give you much hope, does it? Really? This is what I'm saying. When Boris goes and the alternatives are Truss or Sunak, there's you're a bit worried, aren't you? Really?
Well, yeah, but people
It's
who
going to end up with a general election, to be honest, probably.
but people who read all these magazines like them, and it's all good. It's all part of the democracy. It's okay. I mean, Queen Carrie running the country. I mean, nothing. And on that subject as well is like is when you're knocking, in campaigning in Southend West, uh, is this one of the things that you find on the doorstep? There's a lot of discontent with the Conservative Party from, say, people who have essentially been Conservative Party voters for all their lives, pretty much. Is that one of the things that you find when you're campaigning?
Yeah, like I was speaking to someone today, and they said the issue is they feel they could have to vote Conservative because of the issues that happened around Sir David's death, and obviously that's give them a bit of like, we feel like we should owe Conservatives our vote because they care for that. So it's like a vote for Conservatives would be a vote for Sir David in their opinion. But they're also seeing everything that's happening with the Conservatives Party and going, I can't give this party my vote because they're not standing for anything I believe in. And a lot of people are torn, if I'm honest with you. A lot of people are torn on the subject.
Hmm. And do you think then that when the by-election day comes, whether you win or not, do you think like there's going to be a resurgence of a lot of these sort of like, because as far as I'm aware, most of the parties that are standing this by-election are sort of like minor right-wing parties. Do you think that there'll be a resurgence of that sort of like vote, like I don't want to say protest vote because I don't think that's fair, but a vote of discontent against the government, not even if this person loses, but if essentially they have their majority split in half, like we saw in North Shropshire?
Yeah, I feel like there will be some. I'm obviously not naive. I understand that there will be some people that might vote for me out of a protest vote, but every vote counts at the end of the day, so I won't argue against it. But yeah, there will be people that maybe have been lifelong Conservative voters and under normal circumstances would vote Conservative. But when you're seeing the Prime Minister lying and getting away with it, it's kind of hard to give that man your vote.
Hmm.
And that's the truth of the matter.
And beyond that, like, what are the main doorstep issues for you that you've encountered so far while you've been campaigning in Southend West?
Oh, the most frequent concerns are like social care, like the failing social care and the fact that they're just completely ignored. The fact that when they reach out to councillors, that they're too worried about party politics to actually get anything done, as well as housing, like, and the fact that there's no council housing,
Hmm.
there's none available, and if they are, they build like one or two houses on a street, and then the rest of them will be affordable housing. But obviously, affordable housing might be affordable for one, won't be for another.
Hmm.
So these concerns, as well as immigration and illegal immigration, but they're not primary concerns because local concerns take over national concerns.
Sure, yeah. And why do you think that the council, as you're discussing, are not particularly doing well on the subject of council housing then? You say it's about to do with party politics. Could you, if you don't mind me asking, delve into that a bit more?
Well, it'd be more like they're too concerned on focusing on buying the party line and not going too far from what the party stands for. But obviously, when you work in councils and things like that, they have to work together and they have to cross party lines to get things done. But it seems like they're always trying to point score over one another rather than actually get the job done. And that's the vibe I'm getting from the people I've spoken to.
Hmm. Well, like, is it like a matter of their, I'm not, unfortunately, not particularly familiar with the
Like,
sort of, with the, oh, you go first, sorry.
yeah, sorry, I was just going to say it'd be like, say, just like for one random local issue, like the councillors have decided to put the charging for parking down the seafront past 9 p.m. and everyone objected to that because they want the seafront to thrive, so more people come from out of the town so they can come there and they can spend their money and it can boost Southend. But obviously, all of the people that wrote to the council and everything, like, they all raised their concerns, they all said no, and rather than the councillors actually coming together and listening, they just carried on with it anyway and didn't listen to any of the local people because of they're going with what their parties decide to do rather than what they should be doing for their constituents.
Fair enough. And also on that, if you don't mind me asking, do you think it's like a matter of like parties like the Conservative Party and Labour or whoever else it may be, they're so, uh, you know, cozy with their sort of like tribal allegiance to in a lot of these areas, of the fact that even when their sort of constituents complain, they think, well, they're not going to do anything about it, so why should I do anything? Do you think there's that element of it as well? They're smug and sort of like lazy because of the fact
Yeah,
that they know they have this tribal support backing them up all the time.
Oh yeah, it's definitely an entitlement sort of attitude because they don't think, oh, we're the Conservatives, this is a Conservative stronghold, or we're Labour and we've always had this ward, this is our ward. They always feel like you can ignore one or two of your constituents when they're complaining, and then that one or two could end up being to 10 to 20, and it doesn't matter because they're going to vote for you again because they're so concerned about the bad guys from the other side, even though in reality they're both the same, they're ignoring you and you're not focusing on your issues. But to local people, like if you look in the media, for instance, as soon as Conservatives start doing bad, people start thinking, oh no, Labour's worse, blah, blah, blah. Or the other way around, if you're a Labour supporter, you'd say, oh no, the Conservatives are far worse. But in reality, they're both the same. They're not doing anything that actually needs to get done. And they're too busy focused on just point scoring over one another.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel like a lot of this campaigning is sort of like, especially in protection of Boris, is essentially on the grounds that, well, Labour would be worse, or like people saying that Boris is doing a bad job. There's always the, supposed rebuttal that, well, Jeremy Corbyn would have been worse. Surely that's, indicative of like, well, just because one's worse doesn't mean that you have to necessarily stick up for the other guy, surely.
Exactly. That's why in this by-election, we're quite lucky that there is no Labour and Liberal Democrats and Green Party there. So it is more of a one-horse fight from all of us minor parties against the Conservatives. So ultimately, all of us are having a free-for-all against the Conservatives, and hopefully I can resonate enough people to say there is a change, there is an alternative. And then if it happens in Southend by some miracle, I manage to get enough votes to win. If it happens there, people will start thinking all over the country that, oh yeah, we can do this, because it happened in North Shropshire when Lib Dems took off from the Conservatives. And if it starts going round and round, eventually there will be more alternative parties getting in, because people will realise that you can give it a go and change and things will be okay.
Mm-hmm. And also on that, if you don't mind me asking, do you think this sort of cozy attitude that we talked about earlier, the fact that they're not particularly interested in doing much change because otherwise they might, because they think, well, these people are tribally loyal. Do you think the fact that any sort of threat to that is why they essentially attacked you as well? The fact that they've called you a far-right extremist and all the rest of it is because of essentially the fact that the apple cart could be knocked over for once. Do you think that's it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, because it's trying to create an idea of a person before the people have even met you, if you know what I mean, because they know they're councillors, but they don't know me as such. So trying to paint the narrative that I'm an extremist or I'm far right without providing any evidence or any facts about it is just nonsense. But usually normal people would just brush it off, but they're obviously seeing it as some sort of threat, because they do know if they look into what the work I've done over the last 2 years, I'm not afraid to rattle cages to get things done. So ultimately, I would do the same thing with the councillors who are failing on their jobs, and I will use every resource I have available to make them be held accountable if they're failing. And I think that concerns them, because a lot of them are failing.
Yeah, but Hope Not Hate said you're an extremist, and they must be correct, mustn't they? They've lied about me before, so I don't particularly care for what they have to say at all.
Oh, they're big fans.
No. And one other thing on that, if you don't mind me asking, is the fact that how do you feel that there is a push now among certain people like Lawrence Fox and co and some of these other people to sort of like get a sort of right-wing coalition amongst a lot of these smaller parties in order to do well and undermine the Conservatives in sort of a tactical voting way? How do you feel about that? And if UKIP were to become a part of that sort of tactical voting group, would you support it?
Oh, absolutely. I've been saying it long before I joined UKIP that parties need to unite. And it doesn't mean that all the parties have to disband and become under one party. They could just agree not to stand against one another and endorse each other's candidates where they're standing, and do it tactically where you're going to get the most support. But if that happens, that's the way to bring down the two-party system, because it would be so. Sorry about that. I lost my mute there. Second, someone tried ringing me.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, sure. And on that as well, I think I might as well move on to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which was the immigration issue, just generally. You're running on with immigration as a central issue. That's one of the main things you're talking about. Are these more party political concerns or issues that Southend West voters have raised to you, or is it a mixture of both, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, the issues, like, obviously I'm very vocal on immigration and illegal immigration, but I'm also trying to raise much awareness on the local concerns, because obviously, whilst their national concerns are major and they are a serious problem, to someone who lives on the street, they might have another major concern that to them could be the end of the world that's not getting dealt with, even though there's all these other huge problems in the country. So I'm trying to have a healthy balance of highlighting the key concerns as well as the local concerns that people have raised to me.
Mm-hmm. And on that as well is like, what made you decide to cover the illegal migration crisis in the first place, given the fact that beyond some others, maybe like Nigel Farage, you're probably the biggest name in terms of like covering this issue, at least in the United Kingdom. What made you decide to start covering this issue?
Really, it's actually quite silly. I live in like down on the south coast, obviously, and I've always known it's happening, and we've always heard about them coming in on lorries and things like that. But my friend didn't believe me when I was working on my lunch break that they come in, get the border force, pick them up, take them up, load them onto coaches, and take them to hotels. My friend didn't believe me that that was happening. So I just went down, filmed it, put it on Twitter, and then it all went viral. It got like over 1 million views or something. And then I just sort of, to show everyone that it was actually happening every day, I just sort of went there every day to show it. And then COVID hit, and like obviously I couldn't go to work, so I had a lot more spare time. So then I just went down the docks every day highlighting it. And then I thought, right, I'll show you every little detail. And then before you know it, it was a year down the line and I'm still at the docks, and it's just showing it what's happening.
Indeed, and in your work, both independent reporting and working with outlets such as Politicalite, if I'm not mistaken, because you give me information that I've published on Politicalite when I was there, stuff about some of the stuff that's going on in Folkestone and Ken. You have become sort of like the go-to source of many people in terms of coverage of the current crisis. How does that make you feel, and why do you feel that the government has yet to listen or act to the wishes of the British people?
Well, I don't think they're going to act on it, if I'm honest with you, because if they was, they would have acted by now. They keep using the border bill as an excuse to delay everything, but ultimately the border bill is designed to deter, not to stop, and that's something that is very different, and that's what people need to understand. But as for people using me as a source of information, I don't know what to make on it, to be honest. Like, it's just I'm there, and obviously people trust my words, so I suppose that's quite a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember like Ryan James Brodusky, this American paleoconservative author, he retweeted you in discussion about some of this stuff in a positive way. So that you must mean you've made it then, which I think is a good thing. And what has been the most shocking discoveries that you have uncovered while covering all this crisis? What was sort of like the most shocking discoveries? Because I know you talked about this as well at your UKIP's conference speech.
Yeah, probably the most shocking thing for me was the Napier Barracks fire. I think that was the thing that pushed me on to go further at highlighting this and try and get it stopped, because that's a massive insult. That building stood for for about 125 odd years. They've been in the camp for 3 months, and then they burn it down. That for me was insulting.
Wow.
And it's in the same town from me. Like, it's just not far from where I live. Like, it was just an outrage. That was the thing that for me pushed me over the edge. And then obviously I've seen like people who are like traffickers. You can't guarantee they are. And when I first started doing it, there was a few people that would follow me around and things like that in a car, but you just lose them at a train station or something like that. And it was absolutely, but all of that sort of stuff made me realize that obviously what I'm covering is important, because there's people looking into it, which is one of them.
Yeah. And but yeah, they burned down the Napier barracks. But don't worry, they're all going to be grateful migrants who are going to be doctors and nurses one day. I guarantee it. But, the next thing I wanted to ask as well is that what do you think in terms of like the media coverage of this? It's not up until like Farage and you started giving it a lot of attention. The fact that no one really paid attention to it in the press, and even when they did, it was like, well, these people are going to make a positive contribution, like Sarah Baxter in the Times. So essentially, well, Nigel Farage's message was way off key because immigrants are doctors and nurses, apparently. So how do you feel the fact that on the one end there seems to be a bit of apathy towards us by the press, and on the other, complete ignorance?
Well, they're not stupid. They know what's going on, and they've got a narrative. That's the reality of the situation. But I see it as the fact that people have woken up to how biased the media is now. And if you tell them what's happening, they can read between the lines and understand that, okay, there's loads of illegal immigrants coming over. No one actually reads the story and goes, oh my God, I feel really sorry for them, unless you're an open boredom fanatic. Even normal people have the whole, what's it called? They have like the whole concern about it. Doesn't matter where you live in the country, whether you're a young person or an old person, you're concerned about this. Whether you agree with it or not, people always talk about it. That's the thing. There's always that concern, whether they're concerned that they want these people to get here safely and put in hotels, or they're concerned that we have no idea who these people are and they're coming over in their thousands.
Mm-hmm. And also, why do you think that this crisis has been allowed to spiral so much out of control, to the point where, if I'm not mistaken, there's about like over 1 million illegal immigrants in the United Kingdom? And as we've seen in certain events, most likely the Grenfell Tower fire, sort of like the death toll couldn't be accurately counted at first because a lot of the people staying there were illegal immigrants. So why do you think this has been allowed to spiral so much out of control over the recent years?
I think it's the same sort of situation as the grooming gangs. People are scared of race. So obviously, because these people are from a different race, the majority of them, people are scared to tackle it, because whoever bangs the drum and says, we need to start deporting these people, is going to be called fascist and Nazi and you're the worst person in the world and blah, 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 blah. So whoever tackles it is, like, if you look at someone like Farage before he got past the line, his life was like a living hell just for talking about immigration. And then if you went that step further and he started going, we need to deport all these people, it maybe got to the point where he could have got Brexit and things like that. Because the media just destroy you.
And one thing that, on an anecdote on that quickly is just the fact that even as recent as like 10 years ago, just discussing immigration was really taboo, at least I remember it being, because you had people like David Aronovich on Question Time saying to a resident of Barking, which is a problem, which is an area that's had problems with immigration, essentially he was being a racist for discussing it. Even though he didn't even mention race, it was about economics. So the fact that I think a lot of them still have these attitudes, but they just can't openly express it now because they know it looks stupid if they do so, at least from what I've seen so far. And also one thing on that is that you talked about the Borders Bill earlier. How there's been much talk about this upcoming legislation, of which will allegedly solve the crisis. Do you have much faith that such laws will fix the problem, or do you think essentially that is just a red herring?
Absolutely not. It's not going to stop it at all. For one, the only thing that is going to stop it is if you remove the incentives and you push back at sea. They've already made it clear, the border force, that they're not going to push back at sea. They've made it abundantly clear. They'll all rather stand there on strike rather than stop us. And the Home Office will never sack the entire border force and replace them. They just won't happen. So the pushbacks at sea won't happen. The incentives, not one incentive is being removed, and only 5 got deported last year. So despite what they say, the Borders Bill, getting back to it, is not actually going to change anything, because it's only designed to deter. If you read the wording and you actually read through it, it's all tiptoeing around international law and all the various treaties that we actually need to leave, like the UN Migration Pact, etc. And without tiptoeing around these issues, that's how you'll get the job done. But they are tiptoeing around the issues, which they know will come to a situation where human rights lawyers will eat this up. It's probably going to cost the taxpayer even more for supporting this Borders Bill, even though it's what we want, because they're not going to actually get rid of these people. The human rights lawyers, because we're still under all of these conventions, can use those laws to hold the government to account and then stop anything from being deported and stop these. They won't ever be able to stop the people claiming asylum under those circumstances. They need to change the way that we have our asylum laws in our country, rather than just agreeing to international treaties that ultimately are just guidelines, but they refuse to ignore them or scrap them.
And on that, why do you think that the border force, whose job it is to protect the borders, are essentially so wet about this? The fact that the former guy who was in charge, if I'm not mistaken, as he was leaving, said that borders essentially are a pain in the arse. The fact that they're threatening to go on strike. Why do you think that essentially this institution has essentially become, full of sort of people who don't want to do their jobs? I mean, why do you think this has happened?
I just think it's the right people have climbed up the ranks and they've got what they want, basically. They've played a long game, and open borders people have got into positions in the civil service where they can exploit it now and push forward their agenda that they want, because ultimately all they're trying to do is bring over more and more people. And even the head of the border force was, I think it was the Mail that reported it, came out and said that he supports open borders. But the person in charge of our borders to protect them supports open borders. You really couldn't make it up.
Yeah. And also on this is like, what you talk about the fact that the Borders Bill essentially tiptoes around international law. Do you think the solution to that then is to leave a lot of this stuff, like say the European Convention on Human Rights, the Migration Pact, all this sort of stuff? Is it just to simply walk away from all this stuff so actually we can, do well without them?
Yeah, I genuinely believe we walk away and we create our own laws, and if other nations want to abide by our laws, then that's fair enough. But we ultimately need to start thinking of ourselves. We can't keep letting unelected international institutions decide how we live our lives and how our courts decide which is a law and which isn't. It's literally why we voted for Brexit, so we can make our own laws, and now we're still obeying international laws. It doesn't make any sense.
And also one thing on that is that you talk about sort of one other thing I've noticed essentially is the fact that there's a lot of left-wing support for all these people coming on boats, like Ash Sakar defends one, Navarra Mead and all that sort of crap. And I was just wondering, I remember reading a Paul Embry article where he talked about the only people who used to support open borders on the left were people like Trotskyists, anarchists, and sort of extreme liberals. Why do you think that essentially the left has now sort of like become united around sort of open borders as a goal? Why do you think that is?
Because the right oppose it. That's it. The centre, the right, and anyone that isn't sort of far left oppose it, and they get it's petty as it is. There's a lot of money behind open borders. So all of these charities and stuff, whilst they claim to be charities, they're ultimately raking in thousands and thousands for people that are coming over in donations, saying they're going to do this for them and do that. Whilst they do stuff for them, they're also pocketing massive wages at the same time. So if your livelihood is open borders and refugees and asylum seeking and all of that malarkey, they're gonna encourage it and do all they can to protect that income, no matter what.
Do you think maybe in some of these cases because they prefer sort of like the cheaper nannies that they sometimes get and so on, like sort of the James O'Briens of this world who actually support open borders because they know they could get a lot of cheap sort of nannies, waiters, all the rest of it? Do you think that might be a reason why that, despite the claim that they support left-wing causes, they'd rather undercut the working class because, you know, who's going to serve our coffee at Pret after all? That was the question of timeline.
That's what this is the thing. Like they always, one of the common arguments that they use is they need people to come over to work in the fields, to work in the farms and pick vegetables. So ultimately, they're treating these people like cattle, that they need them to go out in the fields and work for them. And I'm pretty sure that was frowned upon the last time I heard. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like this is where it becomes stupid. They claim that the people opposing this are racist, but the people that want them to come over and work in the fields because you don't want to work in the field isn't racist. So it's like, okay, we're just going to import loads of people to come over here and work and do cheap labor and deliver takeaways and drive you around in taxis and blah, 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 blah. And they're saying all of this is what the actual public want. But in reality, it's just what the upper class want. And we have no choice on it. We never get asked on it. No one's ever asked if they want this, if they want any form of immigration. They're just forced upon you.
Yeah, I mean, I laugh at like at least some people are a little bit more honest about it. It's like the person in question time I just mentioned, he said like, "Who's going to serve our coffee at Pret?" Or Kelly Osbourne when she was criticizing Trump, saying essentially, "Who's going to clean your toilet, Donald Trump, if you kick all the Latinos out?" Like, I wish more people were a bit more honest like that, as opposed to the sort of wheelie words they hide by. But how do you feel essentially that the left have gone from, say, someone like Bob Crow in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, who was on Question Time, who's quite a huge left-wing, figure and, head of the RMT union, saying essentially he's not against immigration because of racial matters, it's because of economic ones, because as a union leader, he understood this. And even people like Polly Toynbee in The Guardian back in 2005 saying actually mass immigration is only good for big business. How do you feel it's gone from that to essentially now where in the 2019 Labour conference, open borders, when that was essentially adopted as policy, apparently the conference cheered?
See, this is absolutely bizarre. I can't figure out where the change happens. Like it just seemed to have happened overnight, but it obviously didn't. It's been building slowly and slowly. But for the Labour Party to oppose the working class like they do these days is absolutely sickening, really. Like, when you think back 20, 30 years ago, everyone would rely on Labour because the Tories would just lie to you anyway. So they at least they had that alternative where, well, we don't agree with everything they've got, but at least they stand up for the working man and blah, 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 blah. But now they don't have a care in the world for the working man. It seems they care about the middle class, posh boys from down in Bristol and places like that. That's what they seem to care about.
Yeah, or Paul Embry did a good description of that. The guy I was talking about earlier, he's a very interesting writer. And one other thing on that, if I'm not mistaken, is like, how do you feel essentially that even when recently, like reports from last year said that when a lot of these like legal immigrants essentially left Britain because of the pandemic and stuff like that, that actually wages rose for sort of younger people for the first time. How do you feel like a lot of like left-wing people on Twitter are saying essentially, oh, this is a bad thing? And using essentially sort of like Thatcherite talking points in defense of, say, crushing the pay of the working class, pretty much.
It's because they hate us. That's all it is. And they use any angle from any political party. They don't care if it's theirs or not. They don't care if there's any logic behind it or not. They're just in the attitude of they want to win. And at the same time, they want to beat us. They don't particularly care about, this is what's weird. They always say tax the rich, but the only person they ever attack is the working class. You never see them going at the rich people. You never see them going at even the middle class people. It's always, oh, look at that man with an England flag, or
look
oh,
at the gammon.
him. white van. Yeah, look at the gammon, the person who voted for Brexit. You're thick. You don't know what you're talking about. You didn't go to a private school, so how can you vote on something so important as that? Do you know what I mean? And like all of that, and you think, well, what happened to you? Like, what? Do you know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah, and I find that very interesting and all that sort of stuff. And I want to move on quickly to David Amos. I don't want to talk about him too much because I don't want to look like I'm sort of like, reveling in tragedy. But on the subject of
Yeah.
him, how do you feel about his performance as an MP in the constituency you're standing in? And what were his strengths and weaknesses that you would take note of if you were to take over his position?
Well, from talk, I can't speak personally because I've never met the man, obviously. But from speaking to the people, he was very, very well liked. And the thing that they liked the most about him, take away any policies or anything like that, the thing they liked about him the most, that his door was open to everyone, no matter who they were, whether it was Labour, Conservative, no matter what, their door was open and he would listen. Whether he could get anything done for him or not was irrelevant. He would try and he would listen. And that's what they liked about him. And he was always in the town, he was always around, and he was always seen. That's what they liked about their MP. Because obviously, if you've got an MP, you want someone who's going to be in the area, who's going to be concerned about local issues. So that was the main thing I've heard from the locals about him, and that's the main thing that everyone talks about, if I'm honest with you.
Mm-hmm. And following on from that, is that given how the seat you're running in is a safe Tory one and has been since 1950, how do you plan to win over such voters to your side?
Well, he's just being honest and telling them that I'm not going to give them empty promises. I'm not going to give them lies that I can't follow through on. I'm just telling them that I'm one of them. Obviously, I'm not from Southend, but I'm from a place that's similar. It's in the high street destroyed and businesses gone, the seafront slowly getting decimated. I've seen all of that. And I can relate to the people in Southend who are normal people, and I'm telling them that I will do their best. And ultimately, it's just relating with these people so they can hear my message and realise that there is an alternative to the Conservatives who are ultimately going to betray and lie about everything they've done.
And the final question I wanted to ask about Amos was that it seems that from all available evidence, as you were talking about this earlier, he was killed by an Islamist fanatic. How has the problem with Islamic extremism and terrorism become this big? And why do you think all governments of previous stripes have yet to crack down on this major issue or even talk about it?
Well, it goes in hand with mass immigration. That's the problem. If you're bringing over thousands and thousands of people to the country, you're not going to know who all of these people are, even if they've had background checks. And the more that come over, obviously, the chances are that some of them are going to be dangerous. And then even if, like, for instance, you could have people that have come over, then they've lived here all their life, they're absolutely sound, they could raise a child, they could grow to a certain age, something bad could have happened in their life, which wasn't their fault, and then they go to the mosque and meet an extremist, and then that switches them over the edge. And they think that because they've had that bad experience, that's when the extremists jump in on these people, and they use that to exploit them, and then obviously then it goes from wherever. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on that sort of subject, it's like, how do you feel that the Conservative Party, a lot of them, if I'm not mistaken, in 2008, essentially opposed sort of Labour sort of like downplaying the Islamist element of the sort of some of these attacks that were going on, but then less than a decade later, after what happened in Manchester, they're essentially promoting the whole "don't look back in anger" attitude towards sort of like these attacks. What do you think? How could that have happened in the span of less than 10 years? What do you think could have gone wrong there?
I generally think it's just that everyone's too scared to actually tackle it head on because they don't know how to tackle it head on. Ultimately, tackling it head on would mean getting rid of these people from the country, but that's a very big problem that I don't know whether anyone in the government has got the balls to even tackle it.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel like the coverage of sort of like Islamic extremism now is such whereby before it used to get at least some coverage and be buried in the sort of news cycle, but now some these things happen essentially just as soon as the ideology is found out, that it's buried completely. Whereas if he was, say, like some far right, far left terrorist or something, it would have been like headline for weeks. Why do you think that it's become so ridiculously partisan like that?
Because people are becoming normalized to it. It's happening so frequently now that the fact that now the public are they're not even being told about it because it's happening so frequently. And if they was to announce every terrorist attack that happened, the nation would be in outrage all of the time, and they'd be absolutely terrified, and it would create a lot of fear as well. So there is that part to play. That obviously, as people don't want to be looking over their shoulder when they're going shopping in places like that, because that's going to create a very tense atmosphere in the country. So I can understand that. Well, they might play it down. They're also lying to the public and not showing them the reality of the problem, which they need to be prepared for.
And one quick anecdote before I move on slightly is the fact that Douglas Murray wrote a very interesting thing in the updated version of Strange Stuff for Europe about this, noting essentially that, you know, the whole don't look back in anger attitude after the Manchester one was a bit phony, and that, you know, the dead hadn't been buried before everyone else moved on, which is very interesting, and yeah, which I found very interesting. But one of the final things I wanted to ask you about this topic was that, how do you feel that, again, a lot of the left on this have essentially caved in, and they essentially accuse anyone who brings this up of being far-right Islamophobic, and some of them have even gone to the point of defending Shamima Begum, even though, as far as I could gather, most people in the country do not support her. Why do you think that this is the case now?
I think they're terrified that the right will get a foothold, if that makes sense. So if the right have a topic that obviously everyone relates on, and then that goes forward and that becomes public opinion, and they can use that to push forward, like with Brexit, for instance. And I think that they realise now that they just attack anyone that speaks out of it before their voice gets too known, so that when anyone does hear their voice, they'll always think of far right or racist before they think of what they're saying. And I just think it's just a way of smearing someone's name before getting it done.
And before I move on to sort of like the next sort of topic, is that UKIP itself, what, if you don't mind me asking, what's their policies on sort of like talking about this sort of stuff in the first place about Islamic extremism? What is their policies to tackle it, if you don't mind me asking, if you know?
Well, ultimately, there's going to be like, I can't off the top of my head without reading it, I wouldn't be able to give you the exact things. But in terms of highlighting it and talking about it, UKIP has no qualms about having honest conversations about the matter. And the fact is that it needs to be spoken about. That's why I'm speaking about it now. If I had any problems and UKIP didn't want me to, I would anyway. But the reality is that the thing, I think that the way to tackle it is the only way to tackle Islamic extremism and etc. is to tackle in immigration, because the two go hand in hand. Islamic extremism and Islam, for instance, Muslims never used to be in this country, so they've come from mass immigration, and more are coming from mass immigration. So eventually there's going to be a real chance that you're going to get one that's dodgy. And now we've got thousands and thousands that, well, I think it was last reported there was like 5,000 on the terror watch list or something silly like that. So with the reality is that's just the ones they're watching. So it's a huge problem that needs addressing, but how to address it, I think, is tackling immigration. That's the way to address it.
Yeah. And before I move on to sort of like the next point, if I'm not mistaken, like out of the many hundreds, how many thousands like MI5 are watching for terrorism, I swear, like I remember reading the Times, is like 90% of them are Islamist persuasion, which, you know, but the far right are really rising. Oh, okay. And the next thing I wanted to ask on that is you're the UKIP immigration spokesman, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's my part.
What does that entail, and what does that entail, if you don't mind me asking?
Just talking about immigration, if I'm honest with you.
And
I'm just being vocal on the matter, and obviously, I do. When I'm not obviously out campaigning and things like that, I have a lot of information that I keep stored about immigration. I keep all the figures and things like that. So I'm trying to keep some sort of record of everything, so then I can find an ultimate pattern to the problem, so it's easier to find a solution.
And on top of that, if I'm not mistaken, UKIP, when it was, you know, under Farage's tenure, I don't want to talk about too much, but essentially, if it wasn't for that, essentially immigration would still be this taboo subject, if I'm not mistaken. Do you think that now, under sort of Neil Hamilton's watch and with your help, it could do the same thing again for illegal immigration now, like make it less taboo, to remove the sting, and essentially make it more of a viable, malleable political issue?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, obviously, I've been vocal on it since for a couple of years now. And when I joined, I told them that I will still be exactly the same. I'll be vocal on the same issues. And that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to be exactly what I am. So obviously, to highlight it under UKIP, we've got every intention of not just highlighting it, but stopping it. So like not just stopping it so they come over a different route, but ultimately stopping anyone coming into the country illegally, because the first thing they've done when they come to the country is commit a crime, which doesn't ultimately lead very well to how the rest of they're going to be in their lifetime. And I don't see why the taxpayer should have to fork out all of their hard-earned money for people that are hopping over in a dinghy and then getting whatever they want.
And on that, what is UKIP's policy on tackling this? You've already discussed like leaving a lot of these international conventions, but what about the boats? Is it just a matter of turning them around like they did in Australia?
Ultimately, it's not just a matter of turning around. You've got to remove the incentives before you start turning them around. So the first thing would be to stop putting them in hotels. You keep them in secure units so they can't roam around freely, for one, because we don't even know who these people are and they haven't even passed their asylum claims and they can wander around the community willy-nilly. It doesn't make any sense. But our policies are to not just push back at sea, but to remove every incentive that's luring these people over, because whilst the pushbacks, even without pushbacks, just removing the incentives, that would stop the majority, but it wouldn't stop all of them that are coming over for various other reasons. So you have to do the pushbacks at sea as well as removing the incentives, otherwise it won't work. The two have to go hand in hand to make it work.
Do you, forgive me if this is a bit of a trivial question, but do you lot in UKIP take any inspiration from, say, like the Trump administration and the way that sort of handled illegal immigration over the last few years? Like, do you think there's something to take from that that could be applied to the United Kingdom?
It's a very different sort of subject, though. They've got a southern border with a wall. We've got a channel. So stopping ours to stopping theirs is a different sort of thing, because there's the risk of people drowning and things like that, which ultimately leads to few complications. Whereas on the southern border, they literally just built a wall.
And on that subject as well is that, if I'm not mistaken, you've been harassed by the police over, your coverage of this issue, and Nigel Farage was, also had the police knocking around on his door when this happened. Why do you think that they're doing this specifically to people who are criticizing the subject matter? Forgive me for sounding slightly conspiratorial, but this is essentially to sort of like scare people off from talking about the subject.
I think it's to put you off going too far from talking about it, that over the mark there. You might start getting people to waking up and listening and things like that. I've been stopped outside Napier Barracks for literally taking pictures whilst the press were around the corner taking pictures. And they said that I might commit an act of terrorism.
Oh my God.
I was like, really? I'm literally taking a picture of a fence.
But, if Extinction Rebellion, do their thing and insulate Britain, block motorways, it's the people who moan at them who get charged. That's all, because these people are our guys. But on that, I remember watching your UKIP speech, your UKIP conference speech. You were talking about essentially how a lot of these reporters would not film this stuff when a lot of the men were coming over. If I'm not mistaken, the majority of the people coming over are men. But when some women and children show up, they get all the cameras out and so on. Why do you think they frame it in that way? Is it just to sort of drum up sympathy among sort of like the Twitterati and so on?
Well, there's some, I know, obviously, I know quite a few of the photographers. There's some that will just focus on the kids, and there's some that will focus on all of it, but they know that the press will only buy the kids' pictures. And that's down to the editors of the newspapers, as you probably know. So you can't really do much about that if you're just a freelance photographer. But still, they could also play the game of, they could also not send pictures of kids if they know that all they're ever going to put out is pictures of kids, when you send them one picture of a kid and then all of the other blokes that have came over and they're just using that one picture. Not only is it very misleading, but it's also dangerous, because they're setting the precedent that these people are coming over and they're just children, when in reality there are young fighting age men coming over, and they are putting women and children at risk, because some of them have come over and tried to meet little children and have sexual intercourse and try and rape people like that. That they're not conspiracies, those are facts. The articles are there, the court cases are there, like it's happened, and people need to be made aware. And whilst the media's penning some sob story that this is happening and this is happening, reality is happening just around the corner, and the media's not showing the truth. So it doesn't give the public the chance to prepare and protect themselves, because they're not knowing what's going on.
And do you think like maybe at least some of the reason they support, again, all these people coming over is because they can, be easy, sort of like, I don't want to be wage slaves, for instance. If I'm not mistaken, a good chunk of these people might go to, say, Uber drivers, or some of them might be in some of these other sort of like very low wage roles. And like, do you think it's because they actually, they enjoy sort of like this low wage economy because it benefits them, and therefore, because I remember, if I'm not mistaken, the head of the Innocence Drink Company saying he wouldn't want his children working sort of like low wage jobs. Do you think that might be the reason that they're that cynical, that they just support like essentially getting cheap sandwiches and all the rest of it?
Yeah, because all they care about is building up the GDP. So if you can get more shops and things like that And reality is, like you said, these upper class toffs and things like that, they don't want their children working in like washing cars and doing window cleaning. They don't want them doing them sort of jobs. So these people that have come over, and they obviously, from where they're coming from, I can't speak for all of them, but some of the places they're coming from, the wage is better here. So obviously it makes sense to come here to get the minimum wage, because to them it's obviously a good wage, and they can get the living, and then they can make a lot of money. But to say all of them are going to come over and work is very naive as well, because ultimately a lot of them don't. And the ones that have failed asylum seekers, they can't work, but they also can stay here. Yeah. So we're also paying for those, and there's an awful lot of failed asylum seekers. But back to your question, probably the main reason is that they see it as beneath them.
And
modern day servants, basically.
And yeah, but all these immigrant, Uber drivers are going to be very trustworthy. I mean, ignore, say, some of the Mr. Nightmare videos you can watch on YouTube about some of these people who may not be trustworthy, but then again, he's American, so maybe not. And one other thing on that also is that, how do you feel essentially the fact that whenever this topic of, say, refugees gets brought up, the Conservatives always seem to sort of fold on it? Like, I remember watching a Question Time thing a little while back where Grant Shapps, I think he's the Transport Secretary currently, but lovely, wonderful man he is, essentially he said, when the question about this sort of stuff was brought up, it's like, oh, well, we always care about refugees, we're doing the best for them. But whereas, say, it's like a vote about cutting free school meals or wherever it is, they defend it through sort of like hardline Thatcherite ideology. Like, what do you think that they have the attitude that essentially a lot of these people care more about, say, illegal immigrants than our own children?
I think it's just all sound bites, and it's all theatre in the House of Commons, isn't it, ultimately? So it's all playing for the media, and they're just trying to boost their egos and boost their names. They don't really care about our children. Otherwise, they'd be making a hell of a lot more changes than they are. That's the reality of the situation.
Sure, yeah. But one of the final questions I wanted to ask you is, if you lose this by-election, what do you plan for your political future?
Well, I wouldn't know, if I'm honest with you. This is the first time I'm doing it. I'm throwing my hat in the ring. It's all a learning curve for me as well, obviously. But I do intend on standing in Dover at some point. That's where I intend on standing, because it's full circle from what I started, basically.
And funny enough, that leads me on to a really good question, actually, is the fact that its current MP, Natalie, something I can't remember her surname to save my life, I'm afraid, sorry. She actually said, pretends to be the sort of like hardline on this issue. But when a bunch of peaceful people were marching through Dover complaining about illegal immigration, she said they're not welcome here. Like, I'm pretty sure if they were waving BLM signs or exile, she said, oh, they're welcome here, fine. What do you think that these people, again, is it just a matter of talking tough for some of these people, but knowing that they're in these towns where people are concerned about this stuff, but never delivering?
I think the reality is these people are so out of touch that they think that the public are against these sort of protests, and not understanding that 90% of the public are completely. I think just because they seem to get everything wrong, because they're just so out of touch. A lot of these people go to rich schools, they have wealthy backgrounds, they've never walked the streets amongst the normal people, they've never struggled, so they've never had normal conversations. Everything's always been la-di-da to these people. So when they see a protest in the street with loads of England flags and all of this, and they're making a bit of a racket, people think, like herself, will think, oh, we don't want that here. But in reality, the same day that protest happens, the Border Force welcomed in over 150 illegal immigrants.
And also on that subject is essentially like, how do you feel essentially that there seems to be, this is one of the last questions I'm going to ask you, sort of like a double standard in the way these things are policed, like you see again Extinction Rebellion or in like Britain, where essentially the protests are allowed to go cause merry hell, but you see some of these things that happen in Dover and whatnot, or even some of these anti-lockdown protests where police treat them very roughly. Why do you think there is this double standard? Is it sort of just like politically motivated, do you think?
Oh, it's absolutely politically motivated. There's no other reason to it, is there, really? Because otherwise they'd do police fairly both sides. But the reality is, I think, like back to earlier, they're worried that a right-wing movement will come forward again. Obviously, if you look back to the days of, like, let's say, for example, the EDL, they got a lot of manpower and they got a lot of people on the streets to raise the issues. And I think they're terrified that something like that will form again. If you look at the anti-lockdown protests now, the reason they all ignore them when they're massive is because millions of people are going to these protests and they're absolutely flooding the streets of London. And if all of the public sitting at home that didn't know these were happening see it, they might start thinking differently about certain issues.
And one quick anecdote on that before I ask you the last few questions, essentially, like, it just reminds me of sort of like when all these protests, anti-lockdown things were happening in Europe, it took like the BBC and a lot of these other outlets like a couple of days to cover them. Whereas to the Spectator's credit, they covered it quite quickly. I don't know what that speaks to, but there's that. And the penultimate question I wanted to ask you, and this is the title of the show, and it's why I ask all my guests who come on, is what would your ideal world be?
My ideal world?
Yes.
I've never been asked that. Ideally, probably would just be no nonsense, no rapists. Everyone gets treated like equally and like actually has a fair shot at things. And I don't mean equally as in anyone can come over to the country and do this and do that. I just mean that there would be, our people would actually have houses. They wouldn't have to struggle. There'd be people that don't have to sleep on the streets. They don't have to go and get food banks. There's people that are not getting raped, things like this. Like, I could go on, really. The perfect world, you'd have to list off about a million things. That's a difficult question, to be honest.
And the final thing I wanted to say is that thank you for coming on. And to those who want to, sign on to your campaign or get more information about it, where can they find you? What's your social media outlets?
You can either find me on Twitter at Steve Laws, I think it is, or Facebook, Telegram, or directly through my website to get in contact with me on stevelawsreport.co.uk.
Okay, thank you for coming on. And just one final quick thing I wanted to say, two quick final things, is that anyone who else is standing this by-election, you could come on and say, respond to some of the things that Steve has said if you like. And the second thing is also, just rest in peace to David Amos and also Jack Dromey, who died recently as well. So there's that. But thank you for coming on and have a good evening.
Brilliant. Thanks, mate.
That's all right. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and share this video, as well as subscribe to the Ed Interviews YouTube channel, and also the Ed Interviews BitChute channel, and also look at my stuff on Mixcloud as well. I'll have more of this content coming in, and also subscribe to my Patreon subscribe star as well, for more guest requests, as well as free copies of my old books. Until then, see you next time, guys.